Hello students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS IIT Roorkee. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. In this lecture, we are going to discuss about the question why study agrarian change and what relationship agrarian change has with land as the source of social relation, as a symbol of power, and as a relationship with identity. At the same time, we will also discuss the how land and agrarian change can also be looked at or can also be understood while looking at livelihood issues related to class, caste, gender and political hierarchies. Now, agrarian change, the way scholars have understood, they could not find or they have not been able to find one single answer. As we discussed in the previous lecture, change is the fundamental to society, but how does this change happen is crucial for a political sociologist to understand. Why am I saying so? I am saying so because if you are an economist, then you would like to understand agrarian change in terms of economic factors. If you are a sociologist, you would like to understand it with from the factor of social relation. If you are a psychologist, you will do the psychoanalysis of individual farmers or individual members in a rural society. But if you are a political sociologist, what you do is you look at agrarian change not from the perspective of peasants, not from the perspective of farmers, not from the perspective of only one dimension. Rather, you bring politics, you bring economics and you bring sociological aspects in order to understand what is agrarian change. And there's a beautiful article that was written by Professor Henry Bernstein as an inaugural issue for a new journal called the Journal of Agrarian Change, in which he argues that how do we move from peasant studies to agrarian change. And when he's making this distinction between the two, he is giving a lot of interesting shifts that have happened, and why agrarian is not only linked to the one and one something called peasants or farmers. Rather, we need to understand who controls the land or lands and who benefits from agrarian transformation. In this lecture, we'll look at the case of India, we'll look at certain other cases from Latin America, as well as we'll look at the historical narrative of agrarian change. So let us start. The classical positions within political economy starts with Marx, Kautsky and Lenin. Now we have discussed Marx quite often in this course from multiple dimensions. As I had discussed about Marx, that Marx was a multi-talented person. He was not just a journalist, he was also a sociologist, a political economist, a political activist, a lawyer, a philosopher, as well as many other things in between. So when he is talking about agrarian change, he brings it as the first act of dispossession in which there was primitive accumulation, which through primitive accumulation there were dispossession of peasants, and these peasants either become proletariats or they became jobless people who were roaming around the different cities from one place to another in search of jobs. As I have discussed very often about primitive accumulation and this phenomena, so I will not spend much time here. Second, there was Kautsky, and he is supposed to be the first one who started with something called the agrarian question. Now, the argument here is that in an economy, in a society which is undergoing significant transformation from the feudalism to capitalism, can small peasants survive? For the small peasants to survive, there has to be certain reasons, there has to be certain rationalities. And He mainly did not give much answer to this, because for them the small peasants may not be able to survive under the weight of capitalism. Lenin, again, when he was arguing about in the late 19th century, he classified the agrarian relationships in terms of peasantry and in terms of rich, middle and poor, in which there is a kind of capitalist transformation and penetration of capital at every segment, and both the rich, who are the kulaks, as well as the middle farmers, they would form one group, because their interests are reliant on the transformation of agrarian relationships into capitalism, or the existence of the same kind of relationships within the capitalism. Whereas the poor peasants, they are most often than not were the ones who could be classified as agricultural laborers, because they did not have enough land to support all 12 months in a year. So maybe for 6 months they would work as the peasants, and for the rest 6 months they might work as agricultural laborers. So their class interests are always significantly different from rich the farmers, middle farmers, as well as aristocratic farmers. So this poor could act as a revolutionary group in order for the transformation of society. And after a point, this poor can actually come in touch with the proletariats, urban proletariats, to form a, as we had discussed in the previous class, from class in itself to class for itself, and bring revolution. So when Lenin is looking at the political economy of capitalist transformation in Russia, he is looking at the pre-revolution Russia under the Tsars, not the post-revolution Russia. So the question of Kautsky and the question of Lenin and the question of Marx and others gave rise to a significant debate in the form of agrarian question. The second aspect of agrarian question is that what happens if there is a capitalist transformation? Will the surplus that is generated in the land or in the farm remain in the land or the farm, or can it be reinvested somewhere else? If it can be reinvested somewhere else, so what will happen to the agrarian farm? So if you have 100% the profit, can we use 50% of this profit for the reconstruction or the construction of urban locations or for factories? How can this question be answered? But each scholar tried to give a particular answer to the agrarian question, but it continued to the extent that even if started in 1899, in 2025 this question has not been resolved fully. But one common argument that all of them had made was that capitalist development transforms both land and labor relationships. So there was absolutely no hesitation among them that this transformation is happening. So their work was to document how this transformation was happening rather than why. So the descriptive account was more significant. Then came another Russian scholar who would argue that even if there is capitalist transformation, you still have small peasants, you still have small farmers who will survive under capitalism. Why? Because for them, if you remember, now we had discussed in Kalyan Sanyal as well as in the case of Partho Chatterjee, because they are not living for surplus generation, rather they are living in something called need economy. They require this reproduction in order to reproduce their families, and for that they can go to any extent, which was termed as self-exploitation. And this self-exploitation is what creates this dualism of capitalism and the outside of capitalism, or the broader economy which is under capitalism and smaller economy which is still outside of direct frame of reference of this capitalism, what Kalyan Sanyal termed as need economy. Now again, if you come back to Weber, then Weber is looking at land ownership not just in terms of economic power but also status, authority and domination. Because unlike Marx, who did most of his work on political economy in a capitalist society like Great Britain, Weber was studying the eastern part of Germany or the east side of Rhine, which for a long part post 1945 till 1990 was called East Germany. As a matter of fact, it is still called East Germany, and it is considered to be less industrial than the western part of Germany. Here, when he looked at land ownership, when he looked at work, when he looked at workers, it was about status. So, unlike the relationship between a capitalist and a proletariat, or a bourgeoisie and a proletariat, here it is the relationship between a landlord and an agricultural farmer, a peasant or an agricultural laborer. So, domination that we witness here is related to status, is related to authority, rather than just brute economic power. A manorial lord, an absentee landlord or any landlord has a status in society, and others are dependent on this individual for their own legitimacy, for their own reproduction. That is the reason why the primordial relationships associated with status and authority are significant here. But Weber is also bringing in bureaucratic control over land for political legitimacy, because it's the bureaucracy in the modern era which documents lands and land parcels. So, for example, if this is a place where you have a rural settlement here, all the land that are there surrounding this place are owned by people who are residing in this specific settlement. Who owns what or who owns which plot of land is determined not just by your money but also by bureaucratic control of this land, because you might be purchasing this land from someone else, but to register it under your name you have to pay a certain kind of registration fee to the state. So, even if there is a transaction between person A and person B, the state is always there in between, and this state is represented by the bureaucratic control. So, the next, using Weberian framework, Barrington Moore argues that land holding patterns shape regime types, democracy, fascism and communism, because in democracy the entire land mass is not owned by the state, whereas in communism, in fascism, the entire land mass is owned by the state. Everything that is there on the land is owned by the state, because these are authoritarian regimes. They do not require the approval of the people, they do not require the approval of a Supreme Court or a parliament to enact laws and to take control of what they want. Whereas in communism, everybody has a piece of land and all the lands are communally owned. Now, if you look at the same example of land that we have here, this land mass is not owned by individual farmers or individual households who are residing in the village or in the settlement. Rather, this entire land mass is owned jointly by this the settlement, by every household in the settlement on a communal basis. Nobody has individual rights. There could be a chief from whom you take some kind of permission to cultivate a certain land, rather, rather than taking it from some bureaucrat or babu who is sitting there somewhere in the capital city or in district headquarters or at the Tehsildar's office. This way, your ownership of land, your control over land or land holding patterns tell you the kind of state that you are living in, tell you the kind of regimes you are living in. So, as we have discussed previously also, in most of the societies before capital became hegemonic, it was the agrarian elites who influenced state formation and rural governance. That is another reason why the political sociology most often than not looks at land, looks at the legitimacy of land ownership, and looks at how property transfer happens in terms of both ownership as well as in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of status, so on and so forth. Next comes the dependency and the world systems approaches, because they are looking at whether it is Andre Gunder Frank, Samir Amin, Immanuel Wallerstein and others, the way they look at land, they look at it in terms of imperial power, in terms of finance, in terms of trade. Now this is extremely interesting because it takes us back to history. How Britain became the what was Britain, how the people got dispossessed, how certain people became very rich, how certain the countries became agrarian, how the people got transported as animals from one place to another, how the United States became United States, so on and so forth. Why do you think so many the people from Africa were ferried or transported in subhuman conditions to the Caribbeans, to Northern America? For the simple reason that they can work as slaves in the plantation zones. Why do you think the most of these areas were dominated by those plantation zones? It's primarily because of plantation estates. It's primarily because you require labor power and cheap labor power. There's a very interesting Hollywood movie. If you're interested, you can watch that movie. It's by the Tarantino, and it's called Django Unchained. So the protagonist of this film happens to be Leonardo DiCaprio and others. It's a very interesting movie on this aspect of slave, on this aspect of plantation, and in this aspect of the how do the slaves function in a particular society. But let us not get into that. Why is it that so many Indians moved out of India, British India, to work in certain areas as indentured labor? Take the example of Mauritius, take the example of Fiji, take the example of Caribbean islands, primarily because they were export crops were to be grown, and these crops would enrich the capitalist countries or the core countries. The usual way through which this is depicted is this is the core, this is the semi-periphery, and this is the periphery. Core countries are the ones who happened to be ex-colonizers or the colonial powers. Semi-periphery are the ones who had certain kind of civilization, but they had fallen out of league. For example, China, for example, India, and a few other places. Periphery are the ones who have been at a decline for a very long period of time, and most of the African countries, excluding Egypt and excluding South Africa, form part of this. Now, Immanuel Wallerstein has another very interesting argument on this, particularly in relation to agrarian change. What is he arguing here? He says that both Spain as well as England happen to be in Western Europe. By usual conceptualization, both of them should have been part of the core economy, because even before England became a superpower, or a superpower in terms of having a massive marine force as well as having massive colonies which are spread across the globe, Spain was one of the biggest powers, to an extent that both Portugal and Spain, they had come to different areas across the globe, both in North as well as South America, Africa, Asia, so on and so forth. But if you look at the if you look at the late 19th century and 20th century, we see that Spain is part of semi-periphery rather than the core, whereas Britain is at the core. Why is that so? So he explains that in the 17th, 18th and 19th century, particularly 17th and 18th century, Spain had invested a lot in the marine infrastructure, and they had gone to different areas in South America, in Latin America, North America, as well as others. But they had not, when they got water products from there and brought them to its shores, they did not transform the economy into capitalism. Whereas what the Britain had done is that they had used the resources in order to create finished products. Now, if you know, in case you have your farmlands and on your farmland you are growing rice. This rice, or when it is in the form of paddy, paddy means the rice with husk, so unremoved husk. So if you are growing paddy in your farm or in your land, once it is harvested, you get, even if you are getting MSP, it is how much? 1000 rupees, right? Per quintal, not more than that usually. But the same rice, when it is sold in a packaged form, maybe with a label of fortune, maybe with a label of any other kind of branding that happens, you pay 150 rupees per kg. Now, if it is 100 kg, multiply 150 into 100 and you realize how much a profit is being made here. So, this is exactly what Britain did. They had an agreement with Spain that, okay, you have fertile land, we don't have that much of fertile land, your climatic conditions are suitable for farming, so on and so forth. So, you grow these kind of crops and then you can send all those crops to us, we will process it and then we can market it somewhere else. The same thing was done even in the case of the colonial India, in which cotton was grown in India, fiber was grown in India, jute was grown in India, but they were exported to Lancaster, to Birmingham, to Manchester to be created as saris, to be created as pants, shirts, other kind of garments, and that is again sold back to the Indians. In effect, if your investment, including we became, or Spain became, the providers of raw materials, and we are getting a royalty of maybe 10 rupees. But when we are buying it back, we are spending 50 rupees. Now, when we are spending 50 rupees, that means we are providing an additional 40 rupees to this particular country. This becomes surplus for them, and that is how there is a drain of wealth that happened from Spain, from other colonies and other places like Spain, which are not even colonies of these great powers. So that way land politics can be linked to trade, finance and imperial power. So this is a very fascinating, if you are interested you can go and read for yourself. I will put that in the list of references and further reading. So these are very fascinating ways through which they are trying to understand it. But Bernstein, when he entered this field, he has completely transformed the way we are able to understand agrarian political economy, because he has very specific and significant questions. First is, who owns what, who does what, who gets what, and what do they do with it. And when he's looking at it, he's not looking at class, capital, labor, or state as distinct institutions or distinct attributes. Rather, he's bringing all of them together. While doing so, he says that the agrarian question has resolved itself now. Rather, what the question that we need to ask is not just whether agrarian question is existent, rather in what form it is existent. Does the labor own what it is growing, and who are the ones who are engaged in certain kind of work, and when they do it, who gets what and what do they do with it. In other words, the agrarian question is no longer valid, or agrarian question of capital is no longer valid. Rather, agrarian question of labor is the most significant aspect, because now there is no one class, now there is no one labor. There is no distinction between bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Rather, what is terming it as classes of labor. And classes of labor incorporates various aspects of it, because there's groups or there are laborers who are engaged in contract farming, or the example that I gave, that there are farmers who spend 25% of their work as laborers, 25% of their time in terms of peasants, 25% of their work as the proletariats, and another 25% of their time as jobless. So, no one kind of condition is existent there. So, we witness capitalist development here, but the agrarian question of labor has resolved itself, because the agrarian question of capital has resolved itself because of finance capital, and now the finance is not dependent on the surplus generated on the farmland in order to reproduce itself, because whatever finance you require, you can get it from the stock market, from the market exchanges. Take example of those rice packaging that I just mentioned a few moments ago. All the companies that you see, whether it is Hindustan Unilever, whether it is Adani, whether it is someone else, they are all getting their money not from the surplus that is generated in the farmland, rather from global capital flow. But they are using labor which is existent, which is there on the land itself. So Byres and T.J. Byres and Utsa Patnaik, they have also looked at it, and they have looked at it in terms of capitalist accumulation. But they all agree that we are living in a capitalist society, and capitalism has currently transformed the way we understand agrarian change, the way we understand agriculture or rurality in the global south context. So at the same time, gender, ecology and race are also getting involved in our understanding of agrarian political economy. So the colonial and post-colonial land regimes have also been quite influential in our understanding of agrarian change. It works in a similar way through which we witnessed in our example of the Manchester, of cotton, of jute, so on and so forth in the Indian context, and how this trade relationship was quite different at different points in time. So this about caste and gender also we have discussed now, and one significant issue that I would like to discuss here is that of Dalits and gendered exclusion. Historically, Dalits in India were excluded from land ownership, because they are excluded from land ownership, so they had to work as agricultural laborers for a very long time. Second is that of gender exclusion, in terms of that while in the Indian context, most of the agriculture laborers now are women, but the land is not in their name. The land is always in the name of a male member of the family, or most of the times it is in the name of the male member of the family. So the patriarchal inheritance makes it very difficult for them to own any land. As a matter of fact, there is a beautiful book written by the Nitya Rao, Professor Nitya Rao. It's called Good Women Do Not Inherit Land. And she's talking about Adivasis in Jharkhand, or Santhal Adivasis in Jharkhand, and how the land is a very crucial issue there. As a matter of fact, there are other scholars who have argued that whenever there is an issue of witchcraft in the rural areas, it is primarily against women, or the women who are branded as witches are the ones who own land. And these so-called witches are not willing to partake that land and share it with the men of the family, particularly their son-in-laws. So then the son-in-law would go and brand this woman as a witch, and then either she is whipped to death, or she is outcasted, or she is stoned to death, or she is paraded in the entire village without her clothes. So this way, when we look at gender, caste, class in agrarian relationships, we can witness the kind of unequal relationships. We can witness how inequality perpetuates and reproduces itself at different contexts. In the case of India, we have, as we have discussed before, that we had green revolution, land reforms, and how they were successful or they are not so successful, because the certain areas benefited through green revolution, others did not. The ones which benefited were the ones in and around Delhi, particularly western UP, Haryana and Punjab, and certain other areas. Whereas there are certain states which had good land reforms, like that of Kerala, West Bengal and the Jammu Kashmir, whereas certain areas which were part of Jamindari system, where Jamindars were extremely powerful, which are still powerful, like in the Bihar, UP and many other places, we did not see appropriate land reforms. And neoliberalism has only aggraved it, because now what we see is not just individual farmers or rich farmers. What we rather see is the transfer of land to corporations and foreign investors, because as I said, citing Henry Bernstein, now the agrarian question of capital is regarding foreign investors, regarding corporations, and the massive chunks of land, massive pieces of land that are being sold out or leased out to foreign investors and corporations in the United States, in Canada, in the many other places in Africa and global South. So land has become a global commodity and has become part of global commodity markets. And in order to, if we want to understand land and political sociology, we have to look at how global commodity markets are functioning and what impacts they have on the rurality and on agrarian crisis. But when I say there is a domination and hegemonic movement that is happening, at the same time there are also resistances and historical resistances. That, for example, Telangana, Naxalite, Dalit land rights movement, so on and so forth, they have very long histories spanning for more than 150 to 200 years. Naxalite struggle started right after independence. Dalit land rights started in the 1970s and 1980s. In India, Telangana movement started in the pre-independence period itself. So what we see here now is that every time the capital is trying to resolve a certain form of agrarian change, we have movements which would like to bring the control of land to the cultivators. And there are issues that are there in terms of food justice, in terms of food sovereignty, in terms of food security, so on and so forth, to resist this transfer of land from the cultivators to the people who are in corporate houses and going so forth. Now, in conclusion, I would like to say that land or agrarian question has now been reduced to agrarian question of labor. And in political sociology, when we look at agrarian question of labor, we have to look at caste, class, gender and ecological dimensions, without which we cannot understand or we cannot justify our understanding of agrarian question. So, these are some of the questions that we can think about, we can discuss, and these are the readings that I have been speaking about. Thank you.